Okay, that was a little bit of a rushed turnover, but I'm here and I'm set up and hopefully it's all going to go fine. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the conference. I hope you've had a great morning. As you've heard, my name is Pat, and it is great to be here in Portugal, and perhaps you'll pick up on the accidental pattern that I'm using in my presentation, especially in the title, Power and the Passion. Okay, that's perhaps enough. Are there any other Australians here in the audience? No? There's usually at least one, but I guess I'm that one this time. But perhaps someone else here has spotted the fact that I've stolen the title of my talk from a song by Australian rock legends Midnight Oil. The Oils. Maybe Heroes recognised it. He actually knows a fair bit of Australian music. For anyone who didn't get the reference, which is probably most of you, don't worry, I'm not going to be delving any further into their back catalogue. And really, rather than rock music, I'm going to be talking about something completely different. Instead, my focus will be on open source, its strengths and its weaknesses. I want to discuss whether it's sustainable and perhaps look at how we can improve things. Now, I do realise that the term open source is used in many different ways, and I really don't want to get caught up in semantics. So perhaps we should use the definition from opensource.org. I think it's pretty clear. They say that open source software is software that can be freely used, changed, and shared in modified or unmodified form by anyone. Pretty clear. Although I am a fan of Nadia Eghbal's preferred definition that she came up with a little while ago, which is that modern open source is about building and collaborating in public. Granted, that's very broad and it's a bit more focused on the how rather than the what, but still, both of those definitions are pretty nice. Now, I'm sure many of you, if not every one of you, is pretty familiar with the idea of open source. But still, I'm going to start with some of the easier things first, things that you will perhaps already know. Because at every level of what we do, we rely on open source software. Our text editors are open source, our programming languages are open source, our gems, our package managers, our web servers, and most of our production operating systems are all open source. Why? Why do we use all these different pieces of open source software? Well, through using these, we get to stand on the shoulders of some pretty smart giants. And we've had some of those giants up here on the stage already at this conference. And using open source software gives us an amazing productivity boost. There is so much that we don't need to code because others have gone and done it and shared it with us. Of course, it is software, so it's not perfect. But when things break, we have the option of trying to fix it ourselves. And honestly, it probably saves us a lot of money as well. We don't need to pay someone to go and build these things for us. It also, though, can provide a sense of community. Groups of people working together, helping each other. The collaboration aspect that Nadia references is a key part of the ecosystem. All in all, open source is a source, no pun intended. Well, it was in my notes, but it was no pun when I wrote it. Open source is a source of great power for our industry and for us as individual software developers. The fact that this has been done together, a massive effort of collaboration, crossing borders and beliefs, is wonderful. And developers around the world have built all of these things, not because they had to, though sometimes they did, and not because they were paid to, though sometimes they were, but because they wanted to. Creating things is a source of joy for many of us, and problem solving as well can be a lot of fun. And many of these pieces of open source software come from scratching our own itches, solving our own problems. What that means, though, is that open source software is often built in our own spare time. And that's fine, because code is more than our work, code is our passion. Okay, look, maybe that's not always the case, and I'm well aware that passion is a problematic term when mixed with work. I'm also aware that many of us have not contributed to the open source ecosystem, and that's completely fine. That's completely understandable. I've gone hunting for statistics. I couldn't find any, but if I had to make something up, it wouldn't surprise me if no more than 10% of all developers have ever written any open source code. And again, completely understandable. I mean, some of us have kids to look after. Some of us have second jobs to work because we're not all getting paid Silicon Valley money. Some of us just have other commitments. And some of us just aren't quite sure how. Not everyone has the expertise. And contributions require time, understanding, and energy. And having all three of those in the same moment is a tough ask. And even more so when it's not your own project you are thinking of contributing to. And really, there are bigger cultural problems at play as well, as this quote from Sarah May suggests. When it comes to finding time, most people aren't paid to work on open source. So, as I mentioned, it usually needs to be from our own spare time, and that is not a privilege that everyone has. Yes, I am using the word privilege deliberately here. Privilege is not a bad thing, but it must be acknowledged. It must be recognized so we can adapt accordingly. This open source privilege is why relying on things like GitHub profiles and activity metrics for hiring judgments is flawed. Though it's great to see that GitHub removed at least some of those statistics from profiles a few months ago. So it's nice that people are thinking about this kind of stuff. And really, most people aren't in a position, or at least many people aren't in a position to contribute to open source. So therefore, it must not be a metric for determining who is a good developer. And we know that the tech industry has a diversity problem. We know that. I mean, it's obvious even here at this conference and at pretty much every conference, and I mean, we're getting better, slowly, but there's still a long way to go. And really having our focus on open source contributions then, which is an area dominated by privileged white men, exacerbates this problem. And we give away our hard work, our valuable time for free. For free. Truly, the very height of privilege. But there's a bit more to it than that. And at some point I've forgotten to change a slide, but anyway, there's a quote. We live, for me at home in Australia, for most of you in Portugal or elsewhere in Europe, and maybe some of us in the United States, we live in capitalist societies. And writing open source software does not pay the bills, so giving away our hard work and our valuable time for free is inherently a political action. And if you look back at history, or at least coding history, this political aspect to open source is perhaps not so surprising. I mean, let's take the GPL, the GNU Public License, which has been around since 1989, which is a little while, And they mandate that any code you write that uses or is a modification of GNU license code must also be released under the GNU license. Essentially, everything GNU code touches must also be GNU code. A free software virus, if you like. And that's not a bad thing. That's their goal, which is fine. I mean, what they're aiming for, I guess, is that it should be free to view, modify, or redistribute all the source code for all the software in the world. Not a bad goal, really. But then there's this interesting juxtaposition that in some countries, particularly in the USA, there has been lobbying for increases to the minimum wage and for all internships to be paid. And indeed, people should definitely be paid fairly for their time and their effort. But open source is different somehow? Is that because many of us are already well paid? Again, that privilege shining on through. Giving away our code for free is only part of the problem. As well as freely sharing our own code, we use others' code and we rely upon it. And not just code either, but APIs and services too. The things that Yehuda was talking about earlier, tools like RubyGems and NPM, Homebrew, apt. And while open source code is free, servers to run these services are not. As an example, the servers and other infrastructure for RubyGems cost around $32,000 US per month. And that figure does not include developer time required to maintain those servers. And that distinction is important. Because when we rely upon these systems, we're not just expecting people to spend their time on writing code, but also on support, answering our questions, patching security issues, and with tools like RubyGems, upgrading servers and keeping them secure. I guess these efforts are the joy that comes from having the right combination of skill and luck to build something, a gem, a service, that other people start relying upon. It's also worth recognizing the emotional labor involved in supporting open source projects. If you're not familiar with the idea of of emotional labor, it is when people manage their own feelings as part of their work, which is particularly common in service roles, serving people in shops and restaurants or on the phone or here running a conference center. And open source maintainers face this effort too in their interactions with others via support requests and patches, and they are rightly expected to be polite and helpful, even in the face of rudeness and impatience. We've all been on the internet. We know there's plenty of rudeness and impatience out there. And in our industry, just like in society more broadly, we're often terrible at recognizing and appreciating this emotional labor. You'll often see open source described with the label free as in speech, rather than free as in beer. But I think the more appropriate label that was first suggested by Jacob Thornton of Bootstrap fame is free as in puppy, which gives a much better indication of the energy required to contribute to the community in this way. Now, these are broad strokes that I've been laying down, I realise that, and with all broad strokes there are caveats and exceptions. We're lucky that we have some companies paying their employees to work on open source projects. Thank you. And we're lucky to have companies that pay open source maintainers for support and new features. Thank you. And we're even lucky to have some companies who pay for the servers that are needed for these services. Thank you. This is all greatly appreciated. Still, many of these open source services have become critical infrastructure for our own work. They are incredibly important. We expect them to always be there working, and yet we don't pay for them. I wonder, do we value open source work less because we don't pay for it? There is other infrastructure in our everyday lives that we rely upon as well. Things like roads and welfare systems and government, and we do pay for those, albeit indirectly, through our taxes. So should we be paying a Ruby tax? Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone should pay to use these systems, these services. There is certainly value in keeping things free. We want to keep that barrier of entry as low as possible for anyone who is trying to learn how to code, or who is just playing around. But if everything's free for everyone, then the good times aren't going to last. I've been quoting Nadia Iqbal a lot in this talk, and she's been writing a great deal on these topics over the past year or so. There's so much value in what she's been putting out there, and I will share a link later on to direct you to some of that. It's definitely worth reading. But this idea of a Ruby tax. Well, I mean, tax systems allow for some people paying but not others, right? Those who don't earn a large amount of money don't have to pay tax. Those who do earn a large amount do pay tax. Well, unless they spend their money on sneaky lawyers and accountants instead. The organisation Ruby Together, which I hope many of you are familiar with, is perhaps the closest thing we currently have to a Ruby tax. And look, I mean that in the nicest possible way. You sign up, you become a member, you pay a monthly fee, and that goes towards paying developers who maintain, support, and create new features for Bundler, for Ruby Gems, and for other important Ruby infrastructure. And this is just one approach for supporting what we rely upon, right? There are other possibilities. You could be paying for pro editions of Gems like Sidekick does. You could be paying open source maintainers directly for support. You could be using micropayment systems like GitTip or something like that. Sorry, you probably weren't expecting to be thinking about money and taxes today, were you? But bear with me. If we were to pay a Ruby tax, how would we decide which gems and services get financial support? How popular would they need to be? How would you even measure such things? You probably need an elected body to make these decisions. I don't know, a Ruby government? I'm getting a little carried away. And I am harping on a bit about the money, but that's just one part of the broader picture. The overarching goal here, at least what I think is the goal, is to have a sustainable ecosystem for our industry. Currently, it's not unfair to say that what we have has been built on the broken and burnt out minds of once passionate developers. Lindsay Bieda put forward some excellent thoughts on this matter onto Twitter earlier this year. This is just some of what she had to say. This is another piece. I'm not going to quote every single tweet she wrote, although there was a lot of value in there. Again, links that I'll be sharing at the end. But just to be clear, this is not a financial problem. This is a cultural problem. Wait, that shouldn't be singular. These are cultural problems. There is sadly more than one. So let's recap. Our open source ecosystem is built on top of privilege. The privilege itself isn't bad. The fact that it underpins everything is the problem. And we have become entitled. We are so used to not paying for anything or valuing people's time and labor. And this entitlement can lead to contributor burnout as Aaron tweeted just the other week. And our collective entitlement has also led us to rely upon everyday infrastructure that we don't pay for. Sorry, all this bad news. Such a downer. But don't despair, there are ways forward. We do have many large, successful businesses supporting open source software financially. Companies like Heroku and GitHub and EngineYard. And the Ruby community. As I've already mentioned, we are very lucky to have Ruby Together, looking after Ruby Gems and Bundler and other such important tools. And then, as we heard about yesterday, we also have programs like Rails Girls Summer of Code, which helps, quite obviously, to tackle the lack of diversity in our industry, but also, I feel, addresses some of the privilege inherent in the ecosystem. Now, we can't just step back and applaud these groups for their fine work. Well, actually, no, we should step back and we should applaud them because it is fine work. But we also need to roll up our sleeves. We need to contribute as well. So for anyone here who leads a development team, maybe you run your own company, please get your organization to support these groups that I've just mentioned or others like them financially. Think about how much value you get from open source and maybe give a little bit of that back. Alongside that, it would be wonderful if you could allow your team to work on open source projects on company time. It doesn't need to be anything massive. It doesn't even need to be a day a week. I know, especially for small companies, this is a big ask. But we need to reinforce the fact that open source ecosystems, or the open source ecosystem, is a shared platform. And it deserves some attention from as many developers as possible. Now, if I jump back to Nadia Egbal's description of open source, that is both building and collaborating, I think we're doing okay with the building. I think we've got that one sussed. But the collaborating, that's what needs particular improvement. So for those of you who maintain open source projects, there are some great opportunities here for you to do a few things that may improve the broader picture. I recommend being a little more active in seeking out contributions. Part of why maintainers can become burnt out is because we're not so good at sharing the load. And I am speaking from personal experience here. So investing a bit of time and effort into making it easier for others to help you is probably worth it in the long run, especially if your project is somewhat popular. Now, Charlotte Spencer has written an excellent blog post a couple of months ago on this topic, and you should all read it, and I will share the link later. But I just want to cover some highlights for those of you with projects. Firstly, put some effort into writing better READMEs. Help people write better issues when they're logging bugs. Definitely have a code of conduct for your project. And there are other such suggestions in the blog post. Again, I'll share the link at the end. Also, when you do receive contributions from others, whether they be pull requests or issues or something else, please make sure you respond thoughtfully and respectfully. Ellie Meredith spoke recently at RubyConf Australia on the topic of feedback. And while what she had to say was aimed a little more at development teams, there's so much wisdom in her talk that can be applied more generally, and certainly in the context of open source collaboration. Again, a link I'll share at the end. Her talk is definitely worth taking the time to watch. Okay, but let's jump back to that made-up statistic of mine, which I'm sure is correct, that only 10% of all developers have ever contributed to open source. although maybe in this room it's a bit higher because you're all wonderful. What advice can I give to everyone else who's not in that 10%? First, it's worth acknowledging that helping out can be daunting. It can be a little scary, maybe a lot scary. But search for the low-hanging fruit, the easy things. Things as simple as writing a detailed bug report or offering documentation patches. I love that when that happens. Then there are tools like Your First PR, which was created by Charlotte Spencer, who I mentioned just before. You can follow them on Twitter, and they'll tweet out links to GitHub issues which are aimed at beginners, things that are a bit easy, a great jumping in point for projects. And just generally, don't be afraid to start something. Yes, you may not finish it, but that's okay, because at the very least you'll learn something. And that will help you and everyone else, hopefully, later on. Okay. These are all just small steps. And also, they're all related to contributions. And yet earlier I was making the point that having such a strong focus in our community on open source contributions is unhealthy. And I still believe that. I'm struggling to find the right balance between all of these different factors. It's really tricky. Because I don't know what the answers are. The journey to discovering better approaches to open source in our industry is ongoing. Look, I really wish I could stand here and give you a definitive solution and solve everything. That would be nice. But these are big cultural changes. And big cultural changes are hard. We aren't going to change overnight to become a wonderfully sustainable industry, because we are, after all, entangled within larger societies and cultures which are sharing in this struggle. And the open source ecosystem is certainly far from perfect, and I have spent a lot of my talk picking holes in it. But even so, it continues to provide amazing value to us all. And I really do still believe in open source. It's just, well, here's an analogy that may help. We're all familiar with the idea of technical debt, right? You know, you take some shortcuts to get code working now, but those shortcuts make looking after the code later a bit harder. Well, a friend of mine, Didier Elzinger, has appropriated that concept and come up with diversity debt. When building a company, again, you might rush things, you might hire only privileged white men because they're so easy to find, or instead you could put in the effort. You could create a company with an inclusive culture, be thoughtful about your hiring practices, work hard at building diverse teams. Because in both of these cases, to do things well and to avoid such debt requires thinking about the best ways forward and then acting accordingly. In a similar fashion, what we've got here in the broader open source community is, well, yes, a diversity debt for sure, but also a sustainability debt. We've moved fast. We've built many, many cool things, but our foundations are shaky. And just like with technical debt, as I'm sure you're aware, there's only so far you can go with shaky foundations. So it's time to start refactoring. We've got to start paying down some of that debt. Also, I'm well aware that sustainability debt isn't particularly catchy. If you come up with a better phrase to capture the concept, please do let me know afterwards. Now, knowing what the problems are is a key step in finding solutions. And this is a big part of why I wanted to give this talk to you all. I wanted to get your wonderful and intelligent minds thinking about these problems, if you weren't already. and to see what solutions you can suggest. I want you to ponder. I want your perspectives. Awareness helps us all to be more empathetic. It helps us all to be more compassionate. And you have this awareness now. So I look forward to hearing your contributions in this journey towards making open source, our industry, and our community more sustainable. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of this wonderful conference. Obrigado.